I'm happy to be here tonight. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and I want to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's program, the Harvard Armenian Student Association and St. Stephen's Armenian Elementary School. And in particular, I want to thank one of our panelists tonight, Dr. Luisa Gulesserian of Harvard's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, for her great efforts to make this event happen here tonight at Harvard. This program is part of the NAASR Kalouste Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues, and we're appreciative of the Foundation's interest in and support of our programs. In recognition of its significance and its relevance to aspects of tonight's discussion, we're selling copies of the volume Western Armenian in the 21st Century, Challenges and New Approaches, published last year by the Society for Armenian Studies and edited by Bedros Matiossian and Barlo Dermogradician. Lori Ardumian is in the back of the room, wave. Has copies of the book and should be happy to sell them to you, and if you don't want to buy it tonight, we would encourage you to buy it through our website or any other old way, because it's a valuable contribution to the literature. One of our panelists tonight, Dr. Vartan Matiossian, is a contributor to this book, and I endorse it in this message. So with that, I would like to turn the microphone over to our outstanding moderator, Dr. Anna Ohanyan, who is the Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Stonehill College and a frequent part of these contemporary issues programs, and there's a reason for that, because she's so good at it. So please welcome Dr. Anna Ohanyan.
Good evening, everybody. I think I have two microphones. Let me try one. Can you hear me well? Okay, looks like it's working. It's really a pleasure to be back. I'm really thrilled to be part of the contemporary speaker series that NAASR organizes. And as you could tell from our panel composition, we do approach Armenian issues in a global context. Number one, global comparative, learning from other cultures, other experiences, but also we like to bring in evidence. So it's a very much evidence-based conversation. With that, with all that science that we're going to hear, I'd like to start with a saying that my grandmother, actually, in a remote Armenian village, used to say. I'm not going to be able to translate, but maybe Luisa will. This is probably familiar to all of you. Քանի որքան լեզու գիտես, այնքան մարդ ես. Basically, what it translates to is that what is implicit in it is that the language adds to our social versatility and connects us to many more worlds. But beyond these more obvious social benefits of multilingualism, there is some exciting science behind it. Since 1960s, researchers started to conclude that there is a bilingualism advantage. What this is that it refers to distinct advantages to developing brain. They have shown that a bilingual child switches between languages, her cognitive processes become enhanced, such as problem solving, memory, thought, all of which translate into academic effectiveness. And it appears that to raise a successful child is to raise a bilingual child on a global child, if I could put it this way. Other researchers have been challenging that this bilingual advantage exists, and at least pointing to some conditions under which that transpires. Fortunately, we have panelists who will guide us through some of these debates. The second theme that we're eager to probe is the connection between language, identity, and culture. Languages is one of many cultural markers and tools of cultural mobilization, and understanding its limits as well as opportunities for cultural preservation and identity revival is key. Can culture transcend language? What does language add to our cultural practices? What are the challenges of its instruction? What is the rationale for its instruction? Third, and the important sub-theme to this conversation is the Western Armenian and its instruction. As you probably know, the UNESCO has categorized Western Armenian as definitely endangered category, with number of people speaking it at approximately 250,000. The language vitality in Western Armenian is broadly considered to be in crisis, Understanding the best practices in minority languages instructions, many have argued, is crucial for training and transmission of Western Armenian. As you can see, we have an ambitious agenda today, and I'm promising you a lot, but I'm confident that we can deliver. And I'm very thankful that we have this amazing panel, and let me say a few words in terms of the sequence as well as introducing our panelists. I will start with Dr. María Luisa Parra-Velasco from Harvard University. She holds a doctorate in Hispanics linguistics, and she has 15 years of experience in the fields of second language acquisition and child bilingual development under her belt. Her research interests and professional practices are broad. They are in Spanish as a heritage language and pedagogy, second language acquisition and pedagogy, child language development and bilingualism, to name a few, and importantly, actually, immigration and education. That's something that she will be touching on. She works with parents, teachers, and pediatricians in training to enhance support for multiculturalism. She's the founder and director of the Multilingual Family Resource Center, something for all of us parents to keep in mind. A native Spanish speaker from Mexico City, she's raising 2 bilingual and bicultural teenage boys. Our second speaker is Dr. Vartan Matiossian. Dr. Matiossian is the executive director of the Eastern Prelacy of the Armenian Church in New York and a book review editor of the Armenian Review. He's a historian and literary scholar, and he has a PhD in history from the Institute of History, National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Armenia. He has authored 7 books in Armenian, Spanish, and English, and also has been the translator and editor of many volumes in Spanish, English, and Armenian. He has published numerous articles, translations, book reviews, and essays, mostly in Armenian, Spanish, and English. After our second speaker, we will move to watch segments of a documentary from St. Stephen's Armenian Elementary School, which was generally made available to us by Heather Grafian, who probably does not need an introduction in this community. She herself is an educator and a mother of bilingual, bicultural daughters. And this is a good time to announce that this panel is the first of 2 panels on bilingualism. The second one will be offered in the fall, where Heather will be a panelist, and that panel will be very much targeted to educators and parents in Armenian instruction. So keep that panel on your radar. I'll move to after that, the documentary will move to our third speaker, who is Ms. Luisa Gulesserian, and she's a preceptor on Armenian at Harvard University. She teaches Armenian culture courses and elementary and intermediate Western Armenian. At Harvard and elsewhere, she has taught courses on traumatic past, ghosts, female revolutionaries, and contemporary Armenian film and literature. Her current projects include developing a new multimodal open source textbook to teach Western Armenian, as well as collaborating with the Armenian International Women's Association to produce a literary translation from Armenian of Serpuhi Dusap's 19th century feminist novel, Maida, forthcoming in April 2020 from Iowa Press. In terms of the format, each speaker will have about 12 minutes for their opening comments. I will then direct only 1 round of questions for each one of them. After this, we'll open the floor for Q&A. We only request that in your questions and comments, you limit to 60 seconds. And on the light side, if our presidential Democratic candidate were able to do it in 60 seconds, you will be able to do it as well. So those are the only format issues for now. I will stop here and turn this over to María Luisa.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction, and to all of you for being here. I'm honored that as a Mexican, I'm being part of this conversation with you. I see some familiar faces, and I'm grateful for you to be here. I also want to, and you are going to be the first ones to see me lecturing with my glasses, because I don't see anymore that well. Okay, but thank you very much to everybody who invited me here. It's really wonderful to be part of this community. So The title of my presentation is Shaping the Bilingual Advantages. We are all interested in knowing if being bilingual and speaking two languages is a good thing or not. And what I have seen throughout my many years of teaching, raising children, bilingual children, is that you have to take into account many different factors in order to understand the advantages and the disadvantages of being bilingual. So the advantages of bilingualism are not for everybody. They could be, but I'm going to be talking about the importance of the social context to understand what is bilingualism and the advantages or challenges of it. So we know from research that bilingualism can have some cognitive benefits, what they call cognitive flexibility, that promotes academic achievement and leads to higher academic expectations. And you see that the references are from the 90s, and since then, even from the 60s, there has been back and forward between advantages and disadvantages, and I'll tell you why. But it's clear that if you speak more than one language, you can connect to one or more communities, and that's very important. Speaking another language besides the mainstream language where you live grants you access to other communities. And in this case, because we're talking about an immigrant population in the US, grants us access to our home communities. So that means that we have social and cultural capital that it's crucial for immigrant youth and children to succeed in the adaptation process to another country. If you feel confident and good in your own community, then your self-esteem and identity is strong as well. But are these benefits the same for every child? And here is where research gets interesting, because it depends on the population you work with and you do the research with, that these benefits are true or not. So what research has also shown is that it depends on the social context where the child grows up, that the benefits are true or not. Researchers have, and academics in this field have said that the bilingual development and behavior cannot be considered independently from society, its structure, and its cultural dimension. And when we think about the field of bilingualism and heritage language maintenance, we should deal with the individual and the circumstances that surround her or him on the onset and beyond of her bilingual development. This means that developing the ability to speak, read, and write two languages, it doesn't depend only on the child as individual. This child has to grow up in a family and a community that gives the access to the languages in the oral form, but also in the written form, so the child can understand when to use it and how to use it, and what are the purposes of this learning. So it's not necessarily about the language, it's about the speakers and the resources that they have to develop these languages. So let me show you a couple of images. For example, Spanish here in the US is the most studied language. I can't say foreign because Spanish has been spoken in this territory since the 16th century. So it's not a foreign language, but let's say that it's a second language for some students, and it's the most studied language in the US. But it's also the most stigmatized. So I'm going to show you a couple of images here of the beautiful postcards from Harvard study abroad programs in Madrid and Buenos Aires that students really enjoy. Harvard students go and learn a lot about these cultures and languages. At the same time, a couple of weeks ago in East Boston, there was an incident where a mother and a daughter were walking in at night speaking Spanish, and they were attacked by two other women from Chelsea, and that tackled was because they were speaking Spanish. So you can see here that it depends who is speaking and who is around them, that speaking that language is valued or not. And that's something that's pretty often we forget. We think that it's about cognition, but cognition develops within a social context and community. So let me show you some examples of this context. For example, some children belong to an elite group of parents that, we can choose and have the opportunity to choose or not to choose to send our children to a school that is bilingual. Other children belong to bilingual families and they have the resources right there at home. But other children are from linguistic minorities that, along with their parents, do not have another choice but to learn the mainstream language, to adapt to the new society. And even when they have the choice to speak it at home, some parents decide not to speak it so children wouldn't suffer discrimination and stigmatization at school. So, family plays a key role in the socialization process and the language teaching and language maintenance in children. So a very famous, the father of what we call sociolinguistics, that means the study of how languages work in society, Joshua Fishman, said that family is a very building block of intergenerational transmission. And that's very much true. And it is in the family that social support and transactions with the community have traditionally been initiated and nurtured. It's also in the family that social commitments have not been nurtured. So that means that the child does not learn a language in isolation. It develops it in interaction with others. If we don't interact with the child in the language, that child is not going to learn the language, the patterns, the culture that comes with it, when to speak, when not to speak, how to say things to different people. All that is learned in interaction, not through textbooks. And that means that every child has a particular way of speaking. We all have different ways of speaking. And we have individual differences in the process of learning and in the way we produce that language. So when we think about these different factors, right, who is bilingual? So research now and theory in bilingual development now has come with this idea of a bilingual continuum that could look like this. On the one hand, you have the monolingual English speaker. On the other extreme, you have a monolingual Spanish or Armenian speakers in our countries of origin. And in between, we are, all of us, placed in this continuum. Some of us can speak more of one language than the other, can read and write in different levels, but we all are being bilingual in some degree. And we function in some degree with all these communities. So I know that we tend to think that there's a balanced bilingual, the real bilingual, the true bilingual, but that doesn't really exist unless you devote your life to study both languages professionally. Speakers manage to go from different points and they can keep learning the language, of course. So we talk now in academia about a range of abilities, oral and written, in both languages. That range gives us intercultural knowledge about both cultures, and with it comes a very complex identity. Are we Americans? Are we Mexicans? What if we are mixing both? So it's a complex and rich identity. So the question is, who is bilingual, and if this true balanced bilingual exists? And this question is very important when we work with children and students, Because what happens when they can't speak the language or they are insecure about speaking the language? What is the best way to motivate them to keep going and learn? So these questions are important because they have a profound effect on identity. And there's a saying in Spanish, dime con quién hablas y te diré quién eres. Tell me who you speak with and I'll tell you who you are. So are we going to be switching back and forward, and if we mix languages, are we going to be members of both communities, or we're going to be members of none of those communities? And that's a question that I find more and more with the youth, teenagers and young people that are now the bilinguals of the 21st century. So bilingualism doesn't necessarily mean biculturalism. You can be bilingual without being bicultural. You can speak different languages but maybe don't know the patterns of interaction of other cultures. You can know two cultures and not speak two languages. Like, for example, I can speak Spanish and I have other colleagues that speak Spanish from other countries. We speak the same language, but I don't know necessarily the culture from Spain or the culture from Argentina. And many bilinguals, of course, are bicultural. That depends if they have the chance to interact within their communities. So what's the role of school? I have talked enough about the community and the family. So school provides opportunities, learning opportunities and resources, linguistic and academic. School is also crucial in transmitting positive or negative messages about the language and the way the child is speaking. If I keep correcting my students or my sons, they are going to stop speaking the language because they are going to feel insecure and that they are not good enough, and I'm going to inhibit them in some way. At the same time, I have to give them the information so they can learn the grammar, the vocabulary that they need to belong and to interact with the Mexican community or the Armenian community. So schools are key for also connecting with families and sending this message to the children. Your community, your culture, your language is important in the school community. So for many years, I worked at Tufts University in a program called the Homeschool Connection Program, where we work with parents and teachers, bringing them together to understand each other and to build networks of support for children so the parents could understand the academic system and the teachers could understand the family and help the child adapting and learning both languages. But we also saw that the patterns of preference and proficiency of a language change over time. A child learns one language but then starts learning the other and has many other things to learn, cognitively, socially, emotionally. So you can have three patterns. English develops and the minority language is lost. The English develops and the minority language get, at a point where they cannot advance, or both languages develop. In this case, Spanish and Armenian are the vulnerable languages next to English, because English is the mainstream language and we need English to succeed in this community, in this country. The other very important piece that I have seen in my research and now is key and central to language studies is the factors that mediate our perception when someone speaks. Race and class are becoming very important in analyzing and understanding that perception. Let me give you an example. So we have two children here, and a child that looks white, lighter skin, if he speaks and mixes some words of English and Spanish, he can be labeled as bilingual child. He speaks both languages. But when we have a child with darker skin, at least in the Latino community, and mixes languages, the same production that the first child, we tend to say, oh, he's an English language learner. There's a lack of English. And now we have this term heritage learner of Spanish, meaning he doesn't use the subjunctive, so he's lacking something, okay? So in both cases, we see this child and is lacking, and the other child is performing. Is that about language, or it's about other things, right? So this is very important now in research. So let me summarize, and I'm finishing here. The individual and social factors that shape language development, English acquisition, and academic success. The family circumstances, the child temperament and individual characteristics. Every child is different. The relationship between the parent and the child, which is not the same if it's the first child or the second child. The schooling options and the choices that parents make. The parent and teacher relationship, and if they're in agreement to achieve the goals that they want, and the relationship between the teacher and the child. And understanding the complexity of raising bilingual children in a country that is not our country of origin, I decided to develop this center where I have some resources and I provide workshops and talks, work with schools as well to try to find the best way to bring these pieces together to provide children with best opportunities for bilingual development. Thank you very much. Do you want?
Good evening.
Yeah.
Yes. So the third is in charge. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation to come and share a few thoughts about bilingualism. As you probably have realized so far, it wasn't mentioned in the few words that Dr. Ohanyan kindly said about me. And you may have realized that I am from South America because of my accent. Actually, I was born in Uruguay and grew up in Argentina until I came to this country. But I can consider myself fully bilingual. Since you heard my biography, I have had an academic production in 2 and now 3 languages. And I decided for this event to share a few thoughts or a few autobiographical traits that may help perhaps understand what bilingual means and how do you become bilingual. As I said, I was born in Uruguay. My parents came to Uruguay when they were very young. My father was 3 years old when he came from Beirut to Montevideo. My mother went first to Brazil at the age of 7, and then she got her school education at the Armenian school in Sao Paulo, until she moved to Montevideo when she was 14. And she practically forgot Portuguese, and she became practically perfect speaker of Spanish. So I was born then in a family that was, for all purposes, practically almost practically born in South America. My parents spoke and speak. My father passed away, but my mother is alive, so she speaks perfect Spanish. And in that family is where myself and my sister were born. I went to daycare when I was 2 years old, and family law says that people at daycare came to my mother at the first day and told her, Madam, your child has a problem because he doesn't understand anything we are talking to him. Of course, I went to daycare, which was a Uruguayan daycare. They only knew Spanish, and I didn't know a word of Spanish yet, because at home my parents spoke Armenian and I learned Armenian. My first language was Armenian. So family law goes that after a week the problem was solved because I started speaking Spanish. I started to pick up stuff, so it came out that I didn't have any problem, except that, well, I was monolingual until I started learning other things. So I went to Armenian school in kindergarten in Montevideo and then to public school for 3 years until I moved to Buenos Aires and I became a student at the Crimean school in Buenos Aires, where I went all the way down up to my senior year. I graduated from high school in that school. For those who don't know, in Buenos Aires there are 7 Armenian schools. 6 of them have elementary school and high school. So in a community of, in my calculation, between 70 and 80,000 people, they are able to maintain 7 schools, 7 daily schools, 7 day schools. There is one more school in Cordoba, which is just an elementary school. I mentioned this as a matter of comparison, so you see that in the entire East Coast, where I have so much more Armenians than there are in Argentina, we are barely able to maintain a few schools up to 8th grade in some cases or not. And we haven't been able to have a single high school. Except for, yeah, I have to correct myself, except for one in Detroit that belongs to AGP. But other than that, in the real East Coast, from Boston to the south, we don't have any. So besides that, then I went to high school, I went to Armenian school. What I learned in Armenia, I learned it there. And what else besides the school, I learned it at home. But it happened that apparently my Armenian is so good enough that people kept asking until a few years ago whether I had learned Armenian in Yerevan, in Venice, in Beirut, in Aleppo, in Cyprus, wherever you could imagine except for South America. I had to tell them that actually that wasn't true, that I had gone to school in South America and the rest it was my work. And I came to the fact that, as it was mentioned, I wrote a few books. I have wrote a lot of articles. I have done my own share of editing books and translating. First, from and into Armenian, from Armenian into Spanish and vice versa, and over the past few years, from Armenian into English also. So I was born bilingual in South America, and now I'm kind of becoming a different kind of bilingual in North America. And you may even say I'm trilingual in a sense, even though my knowledge of English is not the same as my knowledge of Spanish, for obvious reasons. The interesting part of this is I'm bringing this as an example. I'm not saying that my example is the rule far from being the rule. In my generation, we had still some conditions to have people who were able to speak both languages, to learn both Armenian and Spanish, and be proficient in both languages. But that doesn't happen anymore, I would say, unfortunately, for various reasons that are not the subject of this conversation. However, the interesting point for me is the following. There is a phrase by a very famous Spanish philosopher, José Ortega y Gasset. It says, part of that phrase, it says, "Yo soy yo y mis circunstancias," which means I am myself and my circumstances. Meaning, in my interpretation, it's myself and what I can do with what is around myself. And how what is around myself impacts on me. So, if someone is going to become bilingual, not everything can be done by a school. Whatever level that school has, whether it's an elementary school, or a junior high school, or a high school itself. There is some job that needs to be done by the individual himself or herself. Myself, in my case, if I had gone the way of so many classmates and schoolmates, probably today I wouldn't have been able to speak and to write and to read in Armenian and Spanish, but only because after I finished my Armenian education, I continued myself working on my writing, on my understanding of the language and everything else. This means also to remember that it's that personal effort that actually makes the difference. The school can put the foundation for learning the language, but then it's up to, and of course it can do or cannot do a great job, because sometimes going to an Armenian school becomes counterproductive, unfortunately, but sometimes it becomes the real foundation, so a child can build upon it and become really the bilingual person we are talking about. And with the following caveat on my part, myself I consider a real bilingual not a person that is able to just to speak, let's say, about kitchen, what is called kitchen Armenian, meaning Hatseper, Chureletsur, Sarana Pats, etc., etc. That's not bilingualism for me. Bilingualism is when you are able to speak, to have a regular conversation in two different languages. You are able to read in those two different languages at the same level, and you are able to write in those different languages at the same level. That's not easy. But that's actually, if you consider yourself that you know one language normally, let's say English, and you are able to express yourself in English in three different categories, speaking, reading, and writing, you should be able to have the second language, wherever it is, at the same level. If not, you are not a real bilingual. You are a kind of bilingual. That's my 2 cents on that issue. And I would like to end up this first presentation on the first part of my presentation, by quoting from a writer who was actually bilingual because he spoke, wrote, and read in both languages, but in the end he wrote in one language only, and that was Jorge Luis Borges. Jorge Luis Borges, in the last years of his life, gave an interview about Armenia and the Armenians, and he made some very interesting observations about our culture and our languages. Not that he knew the Armenian culture or the Armenian language per se, but his general knowledge and his capacity to understand certain phenomena made him make some interesting observations that are very current today. He was asked first, how long can Armenians last in the world? He answered, indefinitely. The longer they keep the language, the better. Because being Armenian is a characteristic that must be preserved. But then in answering to a different question, he made the following observation. I would like to leave these observations as at the end of my presentation. Every language is a way to feel the world. I believe that in every language there are shades of meaning which are precious. Words and languages correspond to different ways of feeling and of conceiving the world. And if you lose a language, you lose that way. So if we maintain the language, we maintain our way. If we lose it, everything else. Thank you.
So while Naidi is prepping the video, we will be presenting a very small portion this evening of the St. Stephen's Armenian Elementary School's documentary on Armenian bilingualism. The first few minutes of the video we will share. And María, we might need your help to put your mouse to it.
No, it's harder.
Oh, it's harder.
Yeah, there it is.
The pointer is there.
Help. He said if we can't do it, to call help.
That's what the president, next time we're talking about,
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay, hello. So thank you to everyone, to the organizers of this event and the co-sponsors as well, and thank you to my two fellow speakers, and also to Heather and to Anna, and to Mark as well for helping run this. So from María, Luisa's, and Vartan's presentations, we learned about the benefits and challenges of bilingualism during our youth. There we go, okay. We learned that in my presentation today, I'll speak about the challenges and benefits of becoming bilingual as an adult. So my talk today is called Hayeren again, the value of learning Armenian as an adult. Anna already mentioned the Armenian saying, Kani lezukides, ein kan martes, which means you're as much a man as the number of languages you know. Our ancestors were able to see the benefits of speaking many languages because of their early diasporic experience. But does this saying and its praise of multilingualism ring true for today's Armenian diaspora, especially for its adult members? In my talk today, I will build on what we have already learned about bilingualism and discuss in more detail the specifically Armenian and adult language learner aspects of being multilingual and knowing Armenian alongside another dominant language. My talk will cover the following. First, I will describe various concerns raised by members of the Armenian community about learning Armenian as an adult. Then, I will respond to these concerns about learning the language. And finally, I will end with a discussion of what can be gained as a result of learning Armenian as an adult, despite those challenges. So let's start by describing the situation here in the United States. According to the latest US Census a decade ago, about a third of those who describe themselves as having Armenian ancestry do not speak Armenian at home. I want to focus on this third of Armenians in my presentation. What does this group of individuals think about not knowing the language? What do they believe about learning their ancestral tongue? I tapped into these beliefs during my work with the pilot program of the Armenian Diaspora Survey, as funded by the Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation. In the summer of 2018, I conducted interviews and collected survey responses from the Armenian community of Boston. Given that I teach modern Western Armenian at Harvard, one of the questions that I asked in my interviews was, what does the Armenian language mean to you? In which ways, if any, is the Armenian language important to you? I'll share a few quotes about the Armenian language from members of our own community, and then categorize them into different groups by the end. In my interviews, many of those who didn't know Armenian expressed the opinion that it's just too hard to learn a language as an adult. One interviewee said, well, it's important, but it'd be very easy to argue that if it's so expletive important, I would have devoted the time to properly learning it at some point. Another admitted, the language seems like a barrier for some people. It's difficult to learn any language as an adult. One participant explained, I don't live in Watertown. Getting over there every week to take classes is not realistic. Another interviewee said, it's a challenge to preserve your Armenianness in the US. You're going to work, and X amount of hours a day, you're speaking English. Not using the language, you start forgetting. These first two categories of opinions about learning Armenian are about the difficulty of doing it. This next category is more about the intrinsic value of learning Armenian. This group argued that learning Armenian, especially its Western variant, is a dead end because it's already a dying language. Here's a quote from one interviewee. I'm a little bit skeptical that Western Armenian has a bright future. I just don't see how it's going to resist all the pressures and forces of history that other languages and dialects have not been able to withstand. In the end, it's going to be subsumed. It's too bad. It will be a loss for sure, but I think it's an inevitable loss. So let's summarize here the issues with those who do not know Armenian, what issues they cite with learning the language. So first, learning a language as an adult is hard. It's difficult. Second, finding venues to learn and use Armenian is also a difficult thing. And lastly, Western Armenian is a dying language and there's no point in learning it now. I'm going to go through each of these and respond to them in turn. So let's start with how it's difficult to learn a language as an adult. According to research, there are a number of age-related constraints on second language acquisition. Research suggests that the older we are when we begin learning a language, the harder time we will have with phonology, or, in layman's terms, pronunciation. Interestingly, the age at which we begin learning a language does not have a significant effect on morphosyntax, or, in layman's terms, grammar. So it might become harder to pronounce Valabukam, or I'll come tomorrow, the older you are when you begin learning Armenian. But you can competently learn how to compose that sentence no matter how old you are. Others even argue that learning a language as an adult offers significant advantages. Richard Roberts and Roger Kreutz, psychologists and U.S. Foreign Service officers, write in their book, Becoming Fluent, that adults can learn new languages even more easily than children if they know what they're doing. They argue that children appear to have only two advantages over adults in learning a language. They acquire a native accent more easily, and they do not suffer from self-defeating anxiety about learning a language. Roberts and Kreutz posit that adults have the greater advantages gained from experience of understanding their own mental processes and learning how to use language to do things. They argue that our adult metalinguistic ability, or again, in layman's terms, our ability to think about language can be leveraged to learn a new language. So, language can be learned after childhood. That was the case with one of my favorite authors, Joseph Conrad, a Polish immigrant to England who learned the language of his new home in his 20s and went on to write one of the most stunning works of English literature, The Heart of Darkness. To those concerned with that it's difficult to learn a language as an adult, here's my general response. It's never too late to learn. The second concern I cited is about the limited resources for learning and using Armenian. Yes, the in-person options we have to learn Armenian as adults are limited to community programs run by volunteers, or to courses like the ones I teach at Harvard, offered by the 30 or so institutions of higher learning, centered in California, Michigan, and Massachusetts. And while I'm inclined to think well of these programs, given my experience running a community language program for many years in Austin, and given my current position at Harvard, I admit that both of these options are subject to problems of access. So, not wanting someone to lose the opportunity to learn Armenian, when I receive emails from people who want to learn Armenian, but live in Oklahoma, Washington, or Pennsylvania, I send them links to new location-independent options with online programs, such as the Armenian General Benevolent Union's Armenian Virtual College, or Learn Armenian Online. These online programs are extending the reach of Armenian language courses in ways that were impossible before. No need to commute to Watertown. The opportunities to use and encounter Armenian have also been expanded because of the internet in wonderful ways. For example, there are online communities of people who are learning the language. We have numerous Facebook groups for Armenian language learners. There's a very active Hayyadin community on Reddit. Many tutors offer Skype sessions. Further, there's a whole world of new media to consume in Armenian. My students love following Instagram accounts in Armenian like Alvod Panir and Lavash Life. So here's a post from Alvod Panir that a student just sent me the other day. So we all know this one, right? We need coffee first. So the internet has truly made accessing Armenian language materials much easier. When before you had to buy fancy equipment to watch Armenian TV, my family had a comically gigantic satellite dish installed in our backyard for this reason. Now you can actually just visit Instagram, YouTube, or SoundCloud and encounter people speaking Armenian. There's a wealth of podcasts even, and radio shows in the Armenian language. I'm partial to Beirut's many daily shows on the Vanatsain network about music, literature, movies, and I really love the weekly broadcasts of SBS Australia in Western Armenian. There's so much to see and read and hear in Armenian on the internet, and so many places to engage with the language and use it. So now we come to the elephant in the room. The third concern, that there is no use in learning Armenian because it's a dying language. Okay, so I admit that it is true that the language documentation group Ethnologue has categorized Western Armenian in the United States as a Category 7 shifting language, where the childbearing generation can use the language among themselves, but it's not being transmitted to children. While this designation sounds dire, it is a situation that is by no means irreversible or irreparable. And I will cite a few examples here from other languages to show that there are precedents for language revitalization in other communities. In the case of indigenous Native American languages and Hawaiian, both of those many languages were not revitalized solely through the education of schools and of children in schools. In fact, as explained by linguist Nancy Dorian in her work, even immersion schooling in the ancestral language is likely to be more effective if members of the nuclear and extended families of the school children are also recruited as learners if they are not already speakers, or as occasional classroom helpers, social participants in school events, and companions on school excursions if they are. So in this case, and I want to stress this, having more adult learners of the language can help a language's vitality. Another researcher, Timothy Curry Armstrong, found in his research that teaching an endangered minority language like Gaelic to parents with children in minority language immersion education should help these parents to positively engage with their children's bilingual development, and at the same time should serve as an effective tactic for language revitalization. However, to succeed on both counts, parents need to learn not only how to speak the language, but also how to use the language outside the classroom, and specifically, how to encourage the use of the language with their children in their home. Taking these examples to heart, we can say that if we are in the situation where Western Armenian is haphazardly spoken by the childbearing generation, there's an incentive to learn the language as an adult because, as shown by the examples of other minority language revitalization efforts, the parent age group needs to feel confident in their own abilities to use the language. More speakers, no matter how old they are, helps here. Not learning Armenian as an adult because it's a dying language is a self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecy. So now that we've gotten these three concerns out of the way, it's time to come to the end of my presentation, the last part, about the benefits of learning an ancestral language. So I'll just list a few here. Armenian, learning it, even as an adult, gives you the opportunity to use it as a secret language. It's really great to be able to talk about things secretly out in public. It's nice. Second, Armenian also gives you, learning Armenian as an adult gives you the opportunity to engage with a beautiful language that has over 2 millennia of history. In the early 19th century, Romantic poet Lord Byron learned the language with militaris monks in Venice, in Venedig, and he wrote his Armenian exercises in poetry. And he wrote in that book, "It is a rich language and would amply repay anyone the trouble of learning it." And I cite Byron here especially, not only because he praises a language that I very much love, but also because he is an adult who learned the language. And guess what? He was able to write in Armenian. At the very bottom, you can see he wrote Lord Byron in kind of like a scribble, but he did it. Third, learning Armenian can give you a way to combat the mental degradation that occurs with age. So neurolinguist Mark Antonio and his research team suggest that adult language learners benefit from their experience-based linguistic knowledge, increased higher order brain development, and more complex cognitive processing. Learning another language, even as an adult, helps combat some of the detrimental effects of aging on our brains. Fourth, knowing Armenian can provide you with the opportunity to connect more intimately with your family or with an ethnic community with certain cultural characteristics. Education scholar Alison L. Imbens-Bailey describes the effect on community involvement of knowing an ancestral language. In her study, she interviewed first and second generation Armenian American youth to explore the importance of being proficient in Armenian. She found that bilingual Armenian adolescents expressed a closer affinity with the Armenian community than those who were monolingual in English. Imbens-Bailey's work suggests that knowledge of one's ancestral language may help maintain ethnic participation, which may in turn reinforce ethnic identity. And fifth, knowing Armenian can help you achieve a better understanding of Armenian culture and yourself. Another interviewee that participated in the Armenian diaspora survey shared that, I feel like I'm just a kebab pilav Armenian if I don't know Armenian. Here's what my own experience with teaching a language has shown me. I'll read a quote now from one of my end-of-year course evaluations to give you an idea of the connection between language and identity. So my student writes, "This class has allowed me to connect to my Armenian roots on a deeper level than before. Before this class, my connection to Armenia was just through my last name, stories from my family, and food. Now, knowing more about the culture through learning the language, I have realized that a lot of things in my life have a connection to Armenian. I love the connection learning the language has given me to my grandmother, as well as speaking some words to my dad, who now knows a lot less than I do." This is a student whose latent Armenianness came to life in the classroom learning the language. That's her hand in the picture with the word urish, which she wrote on her, which she temporarily tattooed on herself. Urish, which means other, else, different, depending on the context. And she's the one who I can be confident will keep going with the language because it helped her access a part of herself she didn't even know she had. This opportunity for self-affirmation is one of the 5 benefits that you can enjoy if you don't already know Armenian and wonder what you stand to gain from learning it. Luckily for us, language is a learned ability. We are not born with the innate ability to speak a language, but we learn it by being exposed to the language at home, in schools, and in other social settings. Despite the challenges in actually learning the language and finding a place to learn it, there are many benefits to knowing Armenian, and it's not an impossible task. In fact, in the fall, NAASR will host another panel just like this one on the practical steps that we can take to effectively teach Armenian. So, if you're an adult who wants to regain the language of your elders, if you're someone who wants to speak Hayarin again, or if you're someone who already speaks the language but wonders why, what for, remember this sage advice from our ancestors. Kani lezukides, ainkan martes. Thank you.
Invite our speakers over here so we can, I'll just do only one round of questions and I do want to get to Q&A. Can I see, show of hands, how many questions are there? So I can do time management well? Yeah? Okay, very good. So far so good. So the first question that I have actually, one of the takeaways was what I've learned. Before coming to this panel, I thought of language acquisition as primarily technical. So you learn the language, these are the basics, what are the methods. But what I've learned is that I agree with you, Vartan, that bilingualism is a continuum, that there are different levels of language acquisition, number one, but also there is that all of the language acquisition does take place in a cultural setting. María, Luisa, you pointed that out quite extensively, that language needs to be acquired in a particular setting. So my first question in working with the Spanish-speaking communities, how do you effectively advocate with parents? And I'm thinking of parents whose children are not in amazing schools like St. Stephen's. So how do you advocate for parents to really promote the bilingualism, multilingualism? So that's a question for you, but also for María Luisa as well. And the second one, I'm also thinking in terms of models of language instructions. We have St. Stephen's, but we also have a Saturday school. I see Armina is here. So there are different models. And I think, and I'm guilty of this, I would take my children to the Saturday school once a week. And I would kind of give myself a pat on the shoulder. So considering that, okay, I fulfilled my duty. Obviously, that's not the case. So what are there effective models of organizing learning instruction in an immersive way? To what extent is learning in an immersive, experiential format is necessary? And related to this, perhaps, all of you can sort of keep this in the back of your mind. You talked about the role of the parents, the role of the school, the communication between the schools and the parents. but what is the role of the community and organizations such as NAASR in kind of advocating for this message? Vartan, I was wondering if you could elaborate, tell us more specifically about the Western Armenian instruction of Western Armenian. One of the legacies of the genocide, obviously, is the loss of the Western Armenians, in addition to contemporary challenges of it. What is the politics of it? When we're preparing for this, you talked about survival. What are the best practices of teaching Western Armenian in the classroom? And do you envision, should Armenia, the government of Armenia, invest in teaching of Western Armenian, in addition to supporting teaching of the Western Armenian here, as well around their diasporic communities around the world? So if we could each take maybe 3-4 minutes each, and then we'll turn this over. Yeah?
Let me see if I can remember all the questions. So, how do I advocate with parents?
That's right.
So, one thing that I have learned is that I always have to ask the parents, what do they want? Because I can want some things, but maybe other parents want other things, and I can't force anybody to, do anything that they don't want. So if the parents want to raise their children bilingual, then they have to speak the language with them at home. And it's fascinating what you said, because when I came here to this country, I was talking to them, to my boys, but I was just becoming aware of how little I was talking to them. I would say, good morning, in Spanish, right? Hurry up. Did you do your homework? Turn off the computer. Dinner is ready. Good night. What kind of input is that? So I realized that I had to interact with them. I had to learn how to interact with them and use language in a rich way, expanded way, that probably I wouldn't do in Mexico, that everybody, they would be exposed by different resources. But here, you are the resource. TV is a resource, right? Whatever, but the important thing is how you engage them in an interaction from early ages, so they want to keep talking to you when they are teenagers, and they learn the culture from that interaction.
Would you agree that culture should be the first entry point? You emphasize culture, talking about the culture?
They go together. Okay. If I'm with children and my parents come and they don't say hello, I say you have to greet older people and you have to use the formal. That's language and that's culture. So language and culture comes together in behaviors and use of language. But to the other point, how do I advocate? And the models, well, how can I say this? There's no one perfect model. The ideal model is to give the most exposure, the better. The most inclusive the school is, the better. But that depends on, if that works, depends on the child and the connection with the family and the resources. And the individual is key. I have 2 sons and they have 2 very different patterns of language development. The one learns it, speaks it very well, is unstoppable. The second one, he speaks more English than Spanish, and I had 2, and they went both to immersion, 2-way bilingual program. The same mother, the same school, the same grandparents, very different linguistic profiles. What do I do with the second one? When he could switch to English, should I say, don't do that, you don't know Spanish? I can't do that, I'm gonna lose him in many different ways. So I just keep engaging him in conversations. I always model him the way to say in Spanish, and I encourage him to talk to me. That's the most important question. So I think that, there's so many things to take into account.
Thank you.
My turn? Yeah. So in terms of the kinds of models that we can use to teach language, there are many, many different ways to teach language, and we all have our preferences, but if we're talking about revitalizing the language, there are actually some really interesting pieces of research in how to do that. And I'm going to speak to the examples we have from the Gaelic community and the indigenous Native American languages, as well as the Hawaiian community. So in those situations, the way that the language was revitalized is they did it through what is called language nests. So language nests are where they would have basically kids hanging out at school in these immersion programs. And once they were at the school, they would have someone who was an elder from the community who could feel comfortable speaking Armenian and had grown up speaking it at home or had grown up with the language as a part of their daily life. And they would have the elder come hang out with the kids, just play with them, and spend time speaking speaking the language, and in our situation it would be Armenian, speaking the language with them, having fun with them, playing with them, but using the language to do it. And they found that this was very, very effective because it meant that the children were hearing, they were getting the input that we need, which is not just of do this, do that, kind of the reprimands that we often get in the language, or go bring me the water, go do this. Lots of these imperatives. It was about making the language fun and something that you had to use in order to hang out with this very cool old person. So what ended up happening is these children were getting the input of the language just constantly for months at a time, and they were really doing a much better job of speaking it once they were exposed to it in that way. But they also found that those elders were great resources for us to learn the language and teach it to adults as well. And so they would have these programs where the elder would not only have these language nests, but they had a helper with them. Someone who was a, let's say, 20 to 30-year-old, 20 to 40-year-old person who was with them, hearing that language too, also interacting with them in the same way. So this is an incredibly successful way to do it. And again, it's about using the language in normal daily life. They ended up doing things like starting to talk, bringing them into science classes and having the elders say something about science in that language, because this is the problem we encounter a lot in Armenian teaching especially. Armenian language gets taught only in Armenian language classes, the 1 hour a day when we see Armenian in a school that is an Armenian school. It's great that they're learning it, and I'm so happy that that exists, but what we need to do a little bit more, and I would say as a community, this is where the community needs to be involved. We need to get Armenian to be not just a language for the 1 hour a day. It needs to be the language in the places where the kids are playing. It needs to be the language where the kids are hearing some Armenian while they're learning about Spanish even, or where they're learning a little bit more Armenian in their science class. They're just maybe every day at the end or something, 5 minutes, they get a wrap up, this is what we learned in Armenian about science. So that way they're extending their vocabulary and they're just gaining a lot more experience in the language. And I think if we as a community can take these lessons to heart, Armenian has a chance.
I'm sorry, can I add just one comment to that? I think that in these interactions, intergenerational, something that we don't often think about and is key is affect. We are interacting with affection. And that affection in the language is the seed for the children to develop further and future interest to keep learning and study the language. And I think that that's really a gift and a precious gift for them.
So it's communal. If I hear you guys saying, it's a very communal exercise, first of all, to be successful.
It's not just the school.
And
the school's not going to do it.
Not just the family. Very good. Thank you. Vartan?
If you ask me about the politics of teaching the language, I would say that first of all we need, as a community in general, when I say community, I'm not talking about specifically Boston or California or New York, as the Armenian community in general in the diaspora needs to come to grips with the fact that what do we want to do? Are we continuing the same self-defeatist position that we have had for so many decades, the reactive politics that we have had for so many decades when it comes to teaching the language or running our schools, etc., or we go further, we go into proactive action. Sorry for the repetition, but we become proactive and we end this self-defeatist idea. When I say self-defeatist, for those of you who know Armenian, who have read that phrase, there's a famous quotation in Shan Shahnur's Nahan Charansiaki, the novel Retreat Without Sound or without music, which says, the language retreats, woe the Ararat, woe the Ararat. Meaning that in 1928, when that novel was written, there was already the talk about the language being lost. This is just barely 10 years after the genocide. This is barely 7 years after the independence of Armenia has been lost. We are diaspora, we are already weeping the loss of the language. Instead of weeping, instead of crying, it's time to start doing something creative. When in 2012 UNESCO said that Western Armenian was a language in danger, everybody started talking and crying that, oh yes, it's being lost. Before that, everybody talked in a very low voice. Then they started to shout from the rooftops. But shouting doesn't solve the issue. We need to start doing stuff. To do something means to really think of, okay, we have schools, we need to maintain those schools. The solution of our issues is not closing schools, for instance, which has happened too frequently in the past few years. The solution doesn't come from, let's say, if someone doesn't understand Armenian, then we cut out Armenian. It doesn't mean that, for instance, we are going to have more people coming to liturgy on Sundays when we have that liturgy in English, which hasn't happened and will not happen. Be sure of that, because language is not the problem. So when we turn language into the problem, then we are killing language with our own hands. Regarding the interaction of Western Armenia with Armenia, probably the government of Armenia could be of some help. But this, in my opinion, first of all, it needs to work in a very close relationship with the diaspora and with those people who are the ones who actually know the language. Because this is like someone asked me, who I'm not a native Eastern Armenian speaker, to prepare a program about teaching Eastern Armenian somewhere. It's not my field of expertise. I'm not a native
Yeah, I mean, you would
speaker.
have to some sort of collaboration.
Exactly.
But do you think that should be on the agenda of Armenian government?
Yeah, why not? Why not? It wouldn't hurt if it's done in a proper way and in a professional way, because in the past we have seen many unprofessional attempts to do those things. I mean, if this is going to happen in a professional way, better not happen.
Thank you very much, Vartan. So let me open this up and collect questions. I'll take 3 at a time. 60 seconds. Yes.
I think one of the pictures you put in the beginning was with the dark-skinned and light-skinned kids, and how the same thing. In Armenian, we have a different thing happened after the genocide, where Armenians left. Armenians who went to a already developed economies, they were thought of as the language, the culture, as something holding you back. So US, France, who had large Armenian populations, those within a generation. Argentina was one of those cultures, wasn't developed at that time, in the 1920s. Until now, I've been to Argentina, Buenos Aires. people think of Armenians as well-off, well-educated. So the Armenians understand that that's a social contract. You know, they're ahead if they keep that up. Well, that hasn't been in the US or in France or other places. You know, same way in the Middle East, people who went to the Middle East, they knew how to read and write better than the locals. They knew how to function economically. Everybody, you know, you go to Beirut, Cairo, you know, Aleppo, they know the Armenians are well off. They have the better houses, they're more educated. So in a society like the US, where they're well-developed, or France, or any of the better economic societies, how can the culture be presented as a added value to an individual's daily life? Because at the end of it, people judge each other, regardless of its skin color or economics.
And without, very good. Second question?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for María, for the concept of continuum in bilinguality, because that gives validation to so many people and liberates everyone. So that's great. My observation and therefore something to ponder is how those of us who are immigrants in the United States, and we spoke Armenian at home where we came from, but we each came as minorities from different places, most of us. I mean, I'm not talking about people who came from Armenia. So there is a cultural difference despite the language unity, and that can sometimes affect how we feel, you know, whether we belong or not in a certain Armenian school, depending on, I mean, there is a cultural multiplicity there, and that can sometimes cause difficulties, and I wanted to mention that. Thank you.
And there was a third question that I lost. Yep.
You mentioned about cases of languages that have been revitalized. Now, what has been the extent of the revitalization, and how do you measure that success?
Very good. Let's take this question, and then we'll open another round. Yeah? You guys want to take some
I can
quick
start
questions?
with the last question about revitalization. How do you measure it, and what does it mean to be successful when it comes to revitalization? So I'll cite the example of the Hawaiian, the language of the Hawaiian. So there was actually at about 1890 when the U.S. came into Hawaii and took it over and made it and started to become a part of its territories. At that point, there was a concerted effort to not use Hawaiian. They wanted English. So Hawaiian started disappearing from the schools. What ended up happening is after about 3 generations of that, in the 60s, there was a scholar who started getting interested in Hawaiian, and he only was interested in it because he knew his grandmother sort of spoke it, didn't hear it at home, didn't really hear it at all. What ended up happening is this scholar said, okay, no one in my generation knows how to speak Hawaiian. No one. There's not a single one of us who can speak this language. Okay, well, I want it to come back. So he started himself, just on his own, doing these really just funny radio shows. In the 60s, he would just get on the radio and start speaking in Hawaiian from what he heard from his grandmother speaking. It was very, it was rudimentary. He didn't know this language, but he was trying it out and just having fun with it. That man ended up developing these ideas of language nests. He ended up developing these ideas of using the ancestor, that intergenerational, really affectively important relationship, brought people, the grandparents into the classroom, started doing all this stuff. There's now over 100,000 speakers, if not more, and it's taught in the schools. This was a language that was basically, if we're talking about, it was dead in the sense of no one in the new being born generations was learning that language. Now they teach it in schools. There are schools that are fully bilingual. You're learning science, math, other languages in Hawaiian, and those children are not being held back. Those kids are going to Ivy League colleges. They are still performing at very high levels. What I would say, how do you measure revitalization, is if the kid is speaking it of his own accord. And there is a group of people using it. Those children are using it on their own because they love it. It's a language of their life. That is revitalization, and it's possible.
Thank you. So for both questions, right? I mentioned the sociolinguist Joshua Fishman, and he said that the U.S. was a graveyard of languages. So it's very hard to maintain languages and cultures in this country, apparently in particular. Even the Latino culture is, going through a process of, many teenagers now and children of immigrants are dealing with this question of identity. It's so crucial because they haven't had the backup of not only schools and family, but the society. Today we were teaching in my class about Latino and stereotyping. And everybody, my Latino students, were able to mention 20 stereotypes about Mexicans and Latinos. And when I asked them about the positives of our culture, they were looking at each other like, what do you mean? And I'm like, oh, what I mean, you, right? So what's happening? So the messages that are sent to minority communities, we have to become aware of them. We have to become aware of these differences within our own communities to leverage and to say, no, this is an add value, but what are the messages that are diminishing this value? I think that that's the first step. It's not easy, and it requires effort, work, community, inclusiveness. How far are we going to go to include? Who are we going to include? Those are Latinos, those that don't speak Spanish anymore. So those are the questions that I think that we have to rethink in a context of immigration and diaspora as well.
It sounds like these are questions that every community deals with. What's the value? What's
Exactly.
the value that's asking?
Regarding your comment question, I agree that there were different scales of integration of Armenians in their host countries. That depended on the level of that country. But let's not forget that in the case of, for instance, France, US, and Argentina, these were basically assimilationist countries where the culture of the majority was, and these were also, particularly the US and Argentina, were countries of immigration which had the issue of how to assimilate the newcomers. So in the case of the first generations coming to the US or going to Argentina or even to France, those people had, and we are talking, let's not forget what level of cultural level those Armenians going to those countries had in the 1920s or 30s. Those people had what we call the complex of inferiority regarding the dominant culture. So they were eager to assimilate into that culture because they needed that culture and that language to survive and to thrive in that new country. Now it's different the situation in the sense that those people going to those countries, if they are immigrants, they are much more educated. So there is not that problem per se of that complex of inferiority that the previous generations had. So at some point they are running with some kind of advantage. But on the other hand, because of I believe, because of a false idea that, well, we need to learn, in the case specific of language, we need to learn the language of the country that has hosted us. And the Armenian language has a second place, if any, for many people as newcomers. Then this is the moment where the Armenian language starts to stagnate or to stay behind as a language of common use. You see this here in the States very easily. People who come from the Middle East come here, and a few years later in their homes they speak English, mostly. Like they were talking English in the streets of Aleppo, right? And they go and they complain that, you know, I sent my child 6 years, 8 years, 10 years to the Armenian school. He graduated from there and he doesn't speak Armenian. How does he or she going to speak Armenian in your home when you don't speak Armenian? Or you start talking Parra-Velasco, Lavel, how was the school today? What do you expect that kid to do? To speak in English or in Armenian? Or to do a shifting going back and forth, which is neither English nor Armenian. So these are very complex issues, but many things starts from home, many others starts from school, and many others starts from community. So it's a mix of all of them, and this is where each of these factors need to be counted when we are trying to have a kind of policy of what to do with Armenian education and language acquisition.
Thank you.
So as everyone knows, children learn when they use the language in different settings. So besides speaking in the school or at home, I think the language will be preserved and revitalized if that language is used in different settings. So what do you think should be the role of our cultural associations, of our youth organizations, of our churches in this effort?
So it really goes back to the question of community.
Yeah. First of all organizations of different kind, they should take, I believe they should take consciousness or awareness that many things are in their hands. If language has any value for them as a component of identity, and it should, they should take measures about that. First of all, if you want to get in touch, if you want to have the children use the language, you need to take measures about it. I will cite a very easy example: correspondence. You send some schools, some organizations, some churches, etc. They send their correspondence only in English. Why? Because everybody reads English. Who reads Armenian? My question is, why not to send the correspondence in both languages? Who said so? I will give an example which attains me kind of personally. The Armenian Prelacy publishes a weekly electronic newsletter called Crossroads. Since 2004. It was published in English until 2019, late 2018. Why? Because everybody reads English. Why do we need to publish it in Armenian too? That this wasn't said. It's the undercurrent, like it's an unsaid opinion. When we started publishing the Armenian version of Crossroads, and by the way, sorry to say, but I am the editor of that. So if there is any fault with that, let me know. We discovered that the number of readers between the English and the Armenian, it was maybe 20% less in Armenian than in English. Just 20%. Not nobody reads the Armenian. So it means that there was a need to have it in Armenian, at least for a certain segment of the readers. And this was going unsaid for so many years. Which means that it comes to the point that you need to do something with the language to show the people that the language is important to you. If it's not important to you as an organization, why it should be important to people? So here is where everything starts, I believe. The organizations need to take stock of the fact that they are the owners of the language. The language is not, it doesn't come from above. It is our language. If it's our language, let's stop talking and let's start doing.
I think that this is really important, and going back to the idea of models of education, I teach a class here that it's called Spanish and the Community. And it's an advanced Spanish class where we study, the content is the Latino experience in the US. So it could be the Armenian experience in the US or the diaspora, but then I place the students in organizations that serve the Latino community. And the students get to use Spanish with the community. Now it's a very complicated community because we have speakers from all the countries in Latin America. But that's amazing because they come back to the classroom and they bring back those experiences and vocabulary and questions about the community, etc. And the organizations benefit greatly from that kind of volunteering, internship. So I don't know if schools can partner, university can partner with the organizations that use the language, and the students get to use the language in a practical way, meaningful way for the community, in the community. So I think that connection can also be, very productive.
We're slowly ending. We have one more question. Why won't we take the question?
Actually, I like everything that I heard tonight. The question that our friend also kind of touched upon, I think needs to be addressed more head-on, and that is the economy. So one of the reasons that I think our friend kind of was alluding to is when we live in strong economies like US, having enough time to learn and putting that extra effort is a bit of extra effort. And let's recognize that in a strong economy it is that much more challenging than in the developing countries. And we can see that in developing countries the language is maintained and actually flourished. In developed countries like US, France, it's more challenging. So I think we have to recognize that and then find ways, methods of learning the language, teaching the language, despite that.
You have a valid point, but if let's say the fact that the US has a strong economy, it makes for a challenge to learn the language, then we should study that phenomenon and find out the ways to get to that according to the characteristics of this country. In the same way that we used to our advantage the favorable circumstances in the Middle East to have for several generations a strong community and a strong language situation, we have to use to our advantage whatever possibilities this country may offer to us in order to advance our needs for the language. That doesn't mean that, okay, so then since the U.S. has a strong economy and everybody needs to be into the English world, and then it means that okay, the Armenian gets sidelined because of that. We should find the way. Again, I agree with what you say. It's a valid point. So then let's find a way to overcome that situation. Not to just sit down and say, okay, there is no future in the Armenian language, so